So our moderator for our upcoming panel dealing with campus infrastructure issues related to developing a competency-based education program or looking at alternative credentials is Hei Okamoto from the University of Hawaii, and our just outgoing chair of our executive council. So welcome, Hei.
Now, I know I have 4 people here with me. It would be great if you were here.
That's right.
One person does not make a panel. Perfect. And Christy is me too. All right, you guys, it's after lunch and we're feeling really... Oh wait, I was told something. I'm from Hawaii and it's 0 altitude and we're fairly, I guess, higher up. So I was told to remind everyone to drink plenty of water and hydrate.
Good idea.
Wow, I feel much better. Okay, let's get started. All right, you guys. Today we're talking about campus infrastructure issues. You know, this is a really great summit. We started in the morning with the really high view of policy and where we're going from the federal government perspectives. Then we looked at kind of the models of competency-based, prior learning. But really, you know, for this to really work, it's these guys and the things that they will be talking about that will help us actually make this happen. Because while what happens in the classroom, what happens online is very important, think back to your experiences. When you talk to students, the things that connected them to the institution were the relationships they made with their peers, with the faculty. And these are the infrastructure kinds of things that unless we have them ready and enabled, that our students, regardless of how great the programs are, the students will not succeed. And so having the financial aid, the student information systems, all of that is really critical to us. So now I'm kind of a last minute sub for the moderator, so I'm not quite sure what order we're going. So we'll just kind of go the order that's printed in the schedule. So we have Christy Amato, who is a student support lead for the TAC grant, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Community College and Career Training Grant that she's leading for Sinclair Community College. And so she'll be talking about the competency-based IT programs at Sinclair that we had heard a little bit about earlier this morning, and really looking at studying their credit acceleration of students through their community college program. Then we'll be followed by Robert Collins, who's the Vice President of Financial Aid for WGU, looking at the very high level views in terms of student eligibility for financial aid at the 50,000-foot level, looking at how people and processes and technology play an important role in completion and competency and also in the delivery of all this. Peter Zanzo was with Pearson on the Open Badges. He's Open Badges lead and senior director of business and marketing development. And we'll end with Michael Riley, executive director for the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers, who I always just call AACRAO. Now, the thing is, you know, one of the things I was talking to someone about is that we're here at this summit because there's so much about this. And in fact, I think I'm here because I have more questions than answers. And so every session is building a little bit more on my knowledge base. So I'm at the very bottom of the competency base, and hopefully throughout this day, talking to your colleagues, talking to your peers, talking to all our panelists, that you will actually develop greater competencies in this area, regardless of what role you play in your institution, so that as you go back, that we together can raise the agenda, raise the bar of how we support our students. So on that note, I'm going to turn over to Christy, and I will just sit in Christy's seat while she's here and drink my water.
Thank you. I did prepare a couple of slides today. So as mentioned, I'm from Sinclair Community College, and our story of competency-based education really starts with the Round 2 TAC grant that we received in 2012. It was a $12 million grant with our partners, Western Governors University, Broward, and Austin College, to develop IT programs to accelerate students more quickly through college and into jobs. My comments today are primarily going to be focused on delivery and student support. I think that we have a lot of conversations about competency mapping, curriculum, faculty, relationships that need to be built, but also important is how will you package your competency-based program in your already existing institution that has a lot of traditions and processes and rituals in place already. And equally as important, how will you support the students? You build the courses, they come, but how do you keep them in the seat? For Sinclair, the decision how we packaged our competency-based model really was predicated on two big, weighty issues for us: time and institutional culture. We had a compressed time frame. We received notification that we had won the TACT grant in late September of 2012 with a start date of October 1. And we had 10 months to roll out our first 6 of 30 courses that we would be developing and enroll 50 students. So we needed a way to scale up quickly and efficiently and soundly. The other key piece was institutional culture, and this is the bigger one. When we decided how competency-based would look at Sinclair, one of the really difficult things for us is we're a very large institution. We have about 25,000 students and 2,000 staff and faculty, and we have a prolific grants office that earns a lot of seed money for different projects. So there's some institutional fatigue around new initiatives, and we didn't want to risk becoming one of those projects that comes in with a lot of money and asks the world of all campus offices only to disappear when the grant expires. So what that resulted in was a change from within model for us. We were not going to be a standalone unit in the college. We needed something that had the best chance of sustaining after the money was gone in 3 years, and that involves some compromise. The first decision that we made was that our Accelerate IT program, as we came to call our CBE program, would be integrated into our already centralized online division. It made the most sense because we could quickly scale that way, and we already had centralized course development and student support, so it made the most sense. Let's build it here and roll it out to the rest of the college as well. We were tapped with creating 30 self-paced online courses, but one of the early decisions we made is that we would take the curriculum in these courses and we would also mirror it and roll it out in our traditional online and face-to-face sections as well. And we did that for several reasons. It was good curriculum, but also it presented us as less of a threat and more of a modality difference. We could come to our IT department and our CIS department and say, we're just giving students another option. We are not attempting to cannibalize your programs here. We're just giving them a different option. We did determine that we were going to preserve the credit hour. We did not go with competency units, and that again was for faster scale up and also because we were already asking a lot of our internal departments. And we knew that if we stuck with the credit hour, they'd stick with us and they'd help us out. But we did want to give the students a more flexible option for entrance and exit, so we opted for a flexible start rolling delivery. Our students can come in every Monday for the first 12 weeks of the term, but at the end of the day we did preserve the 16-week term, so they can come in at any point, but they need to be finished by the end of 16 weeks. And what that allowed us to do was to knock on the door of the registrar's office and the financial aid office and say, we're asking you to bend, we're not asking you to break. You already have processes and traditions and rituals in place to support the 16-week term. Now we're just asking you to stretch a little and look at flex entry and exit for these students. The student support piece is a big one for us. We had already tested and piloted some case management in our online division. But we knew that for a self-paced program, it needed to be more robust. We needed to support students differently, especially a community college student in a self-paced classroom. This is where we got a lot of help from Western Governors because they've really refined and have a solid, sound model for how they support students. And some of our critical elements that I thought worth sharing are, the first one is mapping. When we looked at how we were going to support our students, we realized that we had to have a clear process in place. What is the path that every student will undertake, and how can we begin to really streamline and make that process more efficient? So you have your traditional points of entry for the learner. You have your traditional learner phases here in admit, enroll, retain, complete. But then you also have these services and resources that are layered over each of those phases, and they occur repetitively throughout the life cycle of the student. And what we needed to do was identify those so that we knew who we were going to lean on for help in executing these functions. When we drilled down, that resulted in really more refinement of those learner phases, admit, enroll, retain. And what we decided we wanted to do was, again, similar to the WGU model, we wanted to assign owners of the student experience by phase. And as you look at this, it's interesting because the person that owns the particular experience of the student in any given phase, this does not mean that they execute all functions for the student. It just means that if a student is assigned in the very beginning to a case manager in the admit phase, that person is there to facilitate the functions involved and be the connector between the student and the office that might execute it. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to come into processes that are already established at our college and say, we want to do registration, we want to evaluate transcripts. We just want to facilitate those functions for students. And so case management for us meant simply that for each of these learner support phases, there was an owner to that experience for the student, and they were expected to execute the same set of steps for each student and connect them to the right offices and resources to have all of these things done in the same way each time for the student. Keep them on the path, keep them focused, and make sure that their experience is the same across all students. The final critical element, I think, for us in CBE is data. Our end goal really is to scale a lot of this work across our institution, but without proof of concept or showing them what we've done and why it works, there's little chance that we'll survive beyond October 1st, 2015, which is when our grant ends. So we track pretty much everything. We collect workflow reports. We're looking at how long a student is taking in the pipeline between different functions. So from the point that they're coming in and talking to an admissions counselor, what's the average amount of time that it takes them to complete those steps and then move on to, say, an academic coach. Once they go to the academic coach, how long is it taking the coach to get them registered? We're really looking at locking down those pieces so that we can make recommendations at large to the rest of our campus. The other thing that we do is once the student is actually enrolled in our courses, I just threw up this is a sample report here, but this is pretty similar to what our coaches get every week that a student is enrolled in our program. We're looking pretty closely at, is the student tracking for on-time or accelerated completion? Are there some risk indicators in there, such as engagement in the course or logging in? What is the student doing inside the course? And that allows us to prioritize the interventions or engagement with the student that needs to occur. We also are doing a lot of outcomes reporting and starting to generate our first success profiles, which is basically looking at the end of each term, who was successful in our courses, and can we draw some common denominators so that we can continue to refine the right fit student for these programs. And finally, we do student surveys at the end of each term. We're really interested in not forgetting that it's about their experience as well. We want to know from them, did you enjoy your experience in our classroom? Do you prefer this over a traditional online classroom or a face-to-face classroom? If not, why? And can you tell us more about it? And we're coming back and using that to refine the way that we develop our courses and also our student support. The last thing I would say is if CBE is in your imminent future or imagined future, these are the considerations from my perspective in terms of delivery and student support. It really is about what will the culture of the institution support. For us, it was not a standalone unit. We needed to find a way to integrate into the rest of the campus for sustainment purposes. Looking at the natural owners of functions being considered, there is no reason to duplicate work, and that's also threatening to others in the college when you are attempting to do their job different and maybe prove that you're doing it better. Instead, how can you partner with those areas and leverage what they're doing to improve your processes and create natural owners within your CBE program? And finally, who will own the student experience? There does need to be somebody who owns the lived experience of the students in these classrooms, because this is a bit more of a solitary path for them. They're not getting the collegial atmosphere that they might get in a classroom, and so who's going to be the person that reaches out to them and asks them how they're doing in the classroom and monitors their performance and engagement. This is sometimes I think this is a function that gets discussed behind curriculum and faculty, but it is a really integral piece of the success of the program. And finally, of course, data. If you intend to prove that what you're doing is working, you're going to have to look at data for it. So that's all I have for Sinclair. Thanks.
Thanks. No, I don't have a PowerPoint deck for you. I'm just going to speak to a couple of items. Again, I'm Bob Collins. I've been with Western Governors University for about a year and a half, but I was actually a consultant for Western Governors when they were first created. I was at CU Boulder, and it was in 1997 when Governor Romer of Colorado and Governor Levitt of Utah really took the initiative to implement this program. So in fact, I worked with Sally Johnstone back in the day trying to put the square peg in the round hole called financial aid. So I looked at the list of attendees. I didn't see any financial aid administrators out there. So a few registrars, so if I speak in tongues, you'll understand. So I wanted to try and keep this at the 50,000-foot level, okay, financial aid. It's important for students' access and success. So I just want to describe the student eligibility. Very simple. You have to be admitted in a degree program, you have to be enrolled, and you have to be making satisfactory progress. Simple as that. So let me chunk down a little bit, okay? Admitted as a regular student in a degree-seeking program. So the regular student means they're not provisional. You know, they have to be admitted as a regular student in a degree-seeking program. That's an important first step because the admissions criteria has to be met as you define it at your institution. But when you're talking about competency-based education or these alternative paths, I'm speaking to student eligibility, but a hierarchy in that is institutional eligibility. So when you're talking about your degree programs, whatever academic delivery model you so choose, make sure you work in coordination with your accrediting agency because that is where the program eligibility is established, right? So what the institutional accreditation is what makes a school eligible for Title IV aid. So work very closely with your accrediting agencies to make sure that they're aligned with what it is that you're doing in these alternative delivery models. And programmatic accreditation if you have that as well. So that's the admitted part of it, right? So let's talk about the enrolled, okay? Enrolled means something in financial aid, and it's a critical aspect of financial aid eligibility because, quite frankly, we need to know the enrollment status of the student when they register for financial aid purposes, right? You have to be enrolled at least half-time to get student loans. And for Pell Grant, your eligibility is based on your enrollment status. Less than half-time, half-time, three-quarter time, full-time. That needs to be defined, and so there has to be some visibility or at least some recognition of what is the student's enrollment status for the financial aid department to determine how much aid are we going to award. Let's talk a little bit about the terms, okay? Standard term is something that we're very familiar with at a traditional university. It's either semester or quarter-based or trimester, right? So when I was at CU Boulder, it was fall, spring, sometimes summer. Summer could be a trailer, summer could be a header, you know, and so that was basically what we were working with at a traditional campus. So, I mean, the standard term works and works well for a lot of traditional programs. There's also a non-standard term, and that would be where you have multiple points of entry. And that could be, you know, those summer sessions, mini sessions in the summer. Could be over the holiday break, the winter break. You have 2 or a 5-week session. You know, those are considered non-standard terms. There's another phrase that we use. It's called non-term. That's how we deliver aid in a non-term environment, meaning that similar to clock hours, a non-term student is considered full-time. And the non-term gives institutions a lot of flexibility to be able to start as frequently or as often as they choose. But one thing that you need to know is that we operate financial aid in an academic year. Okay? The statute says, the law says, an academic year is a minimum of 24 credit hours and 30 weeks. So to deliver financial aid, we operate in an academic year, whether you're on a term or non-term or non-standard term. You know, that's the model that you will deliver the financial aid. And you could choose the model that works best for you. When I talk about standard term and non-standard term, it's not an institutional designation. Not everything in your institution has to be defined like that, but your program does. Okay? So you can have a non-standard term program, and you can have a standard term program. You can blend these in your umbrella called your organization. Okay? So the academic year is a minimum of 24 credits, and I think it's 36 trimesters and 900 clock hours, something like that. And that's in statute. The law says thou shalt have 24 credits and 30 weeks in a payment to deliver your financial aid. Financial aid is generally delivered in 2 payment periods, could be more. So so you're not giving the student all of their money up front. They have to pass some thresholds in order to get continued eligibility. One of the other things that we need to establish on enrollment is attendance. Okay, you have to be able to document attendance at least once. Okay, and that's important because that's the initial eligibility. How do you know, before you give that money, those federal funds to the student, how do you know that they're enrolled in attending? I mean, so there has to be some measure on your campus to measure attendance, okay? So it's to establish the initial eligibility. When I was at Boulder, the traditional university, students at the end of the term, because it was a large university, flagship university, they didn't necessarily take attendance. But at the end of the term, if somebody got a 0 GPA, were they really enrolled at all? Right? Why did you give them that money? How did you prove that they actually were in attendance? So that's something that you have to establish to make the first disbursement. That establishes the student eligibility. But it's also the continued eligibility. I think I mentioned that I'm going to stay at the 50,000 foot level, but I might drop down to 35,000 feet here on this one, okay? There's a thing called, in attendance, I read federal registers and fluorescent lights. I didn't get glasses until I was 25. So that's what we do, is we have to comply with the regulations, okay? So one of the things that we look at from a Title IV compliance perspective is, how do we know the student established eligibility, and how do we know that they're continuing to maintain that eligibility? So we have to keep track of attendance, okay? Now, not all institutions have to keep track of attendance. You have to establish the initial eligibility to make the first disbursement, and then you've got to have some method afterwards to do that. In sub-regulatory guidance, the Department of Education has issued 2 types of institutions, one that is required to take attendance and one that is not. And the institution has to decide, are you an institution that is required to take attendance? So let me give you one snippet out of a program question and answer in our website. It's sub-regulatory guidance, okay? So the question is like this. Determining last date of attendance. Is an institution required to take attendance? So the question is, if an institution monitors whether its online students log into classes, is this an institution that is required to take attendance? The answer? No. But there's more. The monitoring of whether online students log into classes does not by itself result in an institution being an institution that is required to take attendance for Title IV purposes. If, however, the monitoring of student activity is tracking academic engagement, then the institution would be an institution that is required to take attendance for Title IV purposes. Okay? So if you're doing this competency-based education and you're tracking student academic engagement, it's kind of hard to argue that you're not an institution required to take attendance. Okay? Why is this important? Well, the feds have this requirement that is, it's called the return to Title IV. Okay? So if a student is getting financial aid and they're enrolled, making satisfactory progress, they can keep that financial aid, and we assume they all do well at the end of the term, and we measure how they're making progress. But if a student just disappears off the face of the earth, then the institution has an obligation to refund those monies back to the federal programs. It's a requirement by statute and implemented through regulation. So for institutions that are required to take attendance, you have to figure that out within 14 days. You have to know whether or not a student is enrolled, and if you don't see any academic activity in 14 days, you have to start taking action to return those monies to the Title IV programs. For institutions that are not required to take attendance, it's a different story, but I'm going to not stay away from that. I'm just going to go with this sub-regulatory guidance that says these types of programs should be required to take attendance. So why is that important? Because the feds don't want, they're paying subsidies on these monies, and if they're not being used for educational expenses, they should be returned back to the programs. So one other thing that they guide us on, well, what is academic-related activity? Okay, how do you know what is academic-related activity? And oftentimes when you ask the regulator a question, they'll give you an answer. Right? They always do. So let me, and I don't mean to get down into the weeds here, but let me give you a citation from the federal regulations because they define that for us. Academic-related activity reads like this: including but not limited to physically attending a class where there is an opportunity for direct interaction between the instructor and students, physically attending a class, submitting an academic assignment, taking an exam, an interactive tutorial or computer-assisted instruction, attending a study group that is assigned by the institution, participating in an online discussion about academic matters, and initiating contact with a faculty member to ask a question about the academic subject studied in the course. That is academic-related activity, okay? Including but not limited to. In other words, there may be other things that you can classify as academic-related activity. So if those are academic-related activity, what is not academic-related activity? They give that to us in the Federal Register. Living in institutional housing, participating in the institution's meal plan, logging into an online class without active participation, hanging out in a chat room, seeing what the social activity is, or participating in academic counseling or advisement. So those are in regulation, and this is what we live with, financial aid administrators. And we really need you to help us figure this out, okay? Because that's really important, because it is the #1 top 10 audit finding, late refunds to the federal programs, and it's very complicated and complex. But what's important to note is that it does take a partnership with the institutions and the student information systems and our learning management systems, because those two have to talk to each other so that we don't refund money for a student who really is engaged in academic-related activity. Or if they're not in attendance, that we do make timely refund. We do take that action. Okay, so that's very important. I also wanted to call out the paper that was in your handout, the All Hands on Deck, some of the 10 lessons. Lesson number 4, build supportive data systems. Very good. Number 6, engage student support services early. Sometimes we're the last ones to the table. You guys come up with all these great ideas on how to do this academic delivery, and we're going to give them financial aid. Maybe you want to invite us to the conversation earlier in the process, because that's important. And then articulate your campus, your CBE programs and traditional data systems. I think those are very good recommendations, among the other 7 as well. I'm going to end with just one segue to maybe encourage you to come to the breakout session at Olympus A. We'll talk about experimental sites and demonstration program maybe. But the last piece of the student eligibility is, admitted, enrolled, making satisfactory academic progress. Okay, that is one of those regulations that we have to deal with, where we have some flexibility about quantitative measures, attempted versus completed, and then a qualitative measure, which is a GPA. Institutions can have some flexibility in how they define that for their students, but I think that's an area where there's some opportunity to experiment in these types of programs, and we need some relief in that regard. So anyhow, I'm going to turn it over to Pete.
I do have a few slides I'll throw up, if I can get them loaded. So while I'm loading, Raise your hand if your institution is already doing a competency-based program. Okay, now raise your hand if your institution is thinking about it, you're here to learn. Good. So I'm in that second with you guys. I'm learning about this as well. I've got one more question for you. I don't want music. Here we go. Okay, raise your hands if you consider yourself a frequent flyer. How frequently do you travel, right? So I'm in both of those classes with the majority of you. So I thought, if I'm going to look at the 50,000-foot view about what the technology-enabled learning experience looks like, I would start with something that lives in my home, which is travel these days. Now, like online education, there are some similarities, right? People have different goals when they travel. You go and travel for business or for pleasure, right? You've got a life stage that might dictate at what points you're going for business or pleasure. So maybe you start with a class trip or something. You move on and take a backpacking trip, you're a little more casual, kind of exploratory. Eventually you make your way into business, you have business purpose in mind. And the focus can also be like local or regional. Maybe you want to go and visit Mammoth Caves. Maybe you want to do national travel. Or, as I got educated, I guess I wanted to do more global travel. So that's where my horizons began to expand and my goals changed. Similarly, we've got support along the way. And the digital world has done a pretty good job for supporting us as travelers, right? So we've got trip planning tools, and we've got people. We've got travel agents, people who serve as a mentor or counselor. Maybe you run into someone who's a frequent traveler, gives you some advice. We've got multiple modalities, right? Some people might want to go on a tour with an organized itinerary. Other people might want to just organize their own itinerary. And likewise, some people may just want to go and explore, wander. We got navigation for while you're out there. You can pull it right up on your phone, right? And GPS, it knows where you are, provides location-based services. So I got into town last night and fired up my Uber app, and I learned that Salt Lake City has exactly 8 Uber drivers. They were all busy at the time that I came in. But the capability was there. You've got tools that help you plan your budget, tools that help you modify your plan once you're in place. And you've got technical concierges who can help you access help when you need it, like you're overseas and maybe you lose your credit card and you call American Express, right? You got to deal with issues around currency and languages. You got to figure out whether or not you can translate that currency that's in your pocket, or whether you should just use your credit card and let the credit card company worry about translating it, right? Language is easy. You just pull up Google Translate, or maybe you actually speak the language. As you go along, you take advantage of a lot of smart mobile tools. And I guess my point would be there's a parallel here for our journey in actual travel and our journey in education. And I'm here to advocate the user experience from the perspective of the student, someone who maybe gets left out of the consideration around systems planning when we think about how do we satisfy our accountability requirements for financial aid and for institutional accountability. How do we satisfy our faculty, our most vocal stakeholders? How do we satisfy parents who are interested but have no FERPA rights to the data that their students are producing? So as we transition from the example of travel over to the example of students on their learning journey, we come back to that life cycle, right? And you saw Christy talk about it a little bit earlier. This is the traditional way to look at it, and this is a model that's evolved probably just in the last 10 years, considering the pre-enrollment track, what do we need to do to attract students, engage them, enroll them, get them registered, retention services, the data required, how to drive that, and all of the systems around how we manage the retention process, the goal completion, the graduation kind of goals that you've got, and finally placement, right? What's the end goal? That's the traditional model. Now the problem, when you get into alternative credentialing and pathways that lead people in, is the problem of life. We're dealing with humans here. And so humans bring their baggage to the table, just like we all bring our own baggage when we travel. As we all know, the majority of college students today are not the traditional 18 to 24-year-olds coming right out of high school, living residentially on a campus, committing 4 to 6 years or sometimes longer to get that original bachelor's degree. They're people to whom life happens. Maybe they start a course, they drop out, or they pick up a few courses, or they pick up a certificate so they can qualify for a job. They get distracted by things. There's this whole issue of time to completion, right? And the question is, how can we produce systems that are more flexible and responsive to those kinds of users, to real learners today, right? People like you and me and the people that we know. So I heard Greg say something this morning in this breakout session that we were at, and I thought, that's good enough, I'm going to add a slide. Where's Greg? Is he here? Ah, all right. Well, so when you see him, you have to tell him I gave him this little hat tip. The truth of the matter is, if you're supporting real humans, the services and the support are at least as important as the academic quality of what you're driving. And so the system you're designing, whether it's technology or whether it's a combination of technology and humans and process, needs to support the full human. So what are the implications, right? Again, if we think about where the students are as learners, where they are as humans, we realize immediately we can't characterize them. There are too many different modalities that come in. Some students do come right out of high school, while other ones come from a job training program. Maybe their employer's paying for their education. They find us in a variety of ways, and they bring a variety of experiences into us. And that's one of the things that personally motivates me around working with open badges. In 2009, I got laid off. I had to fire my whole team that was doing education services for a software company because the economy turned down. I was a disrupted worker. I had to look myself in the mirror and say, what do you need to do to retool to get back in and make a contribution? And, you know, it became a real personal thing for me. Education changes people's lives. That's one of the reasons we're all here, right? But everybody brings their own pathway. So how do we try and support that multiple modality, right? And the reality is, when we talk about multiple modalities, it's not just who that student is and what they bring in, but it's also at what phase of life they are. So they may have started as one type of student right out of high school, and then life happens, and they come back to us as another kind. And they need a different kind of education product, right, or education experience. And then they get further along in their goals, and maybe they get advanced in their career. Now they need a graduate kind of experience. It's a little bit different than everything else. You can't have one type of system that fits all of those modalities. So the flexibility is really has to be built in. And then the one theme I've heard here this morning repeatedly is around the prevalence of data and measurement and assessment. And as I work with colleges, universities, with training companies, with continuing ed programs around implementing open badges, increasingly I find assessment is at the core. And it's the value of the assessment that helps to communicate the value of the education. So, Allison, wherever you are, you gave me the holistic assessment idea this morning, and that's really what I'm talking about. The systems that we design for the learners of the future are going to have to be not just multiple choice assessments, not just the traditional instructor-graded assessments, but the authentic assessments that correspond naturally to the type of learning that's going on. That's a different system design requirement than what we've seen so far. Again, Allison pointed this out this morning. When you start assessing things, you generate data. As you generate data, you can either be snowed under by that, or you can get really good at dashboarding. In order to dashboard, you have to understand who are the people who are going to consume this, who are my stakeholders, and what kind of information do they need to be able to make rapid decisions. So that kind of capability is going to need to be part of the system as we go forward. Let's talk a little about some of these other things. Communicating competencies, well, that's the world I'm living in right now with open badges. And I think that's the promise for open badges. Again, I've said this to some of you individually. badges have been, I think some of us may have a conception that badges are a thing. Badges are just a common file format. They're an empty container. The empty container has particular features, provided that the information you put in it meets those features, it's in the form of a badge. But the badge itself is nothing more than what the achievement is. So when I talk about recognizing and communicating competencies in the form of badges, I'm not talking about granular badges like the Boy Scouts or like the Girl Scouts or like a field trip badge. I'm talking about really meaningful things, qualities that will qualify someone for further learning or for employment. And that's what I mean by communicating competencies. High touch. High touch. What do we mean by that? Well, we talked about it a little with the support services. I can tell you the difference with competency-based learners, and this is something that Ruki from Argosy taught me, was they were doing their system design to support their competency-based program. The differences with competency-based learners and regular in-classroom, on-campus learners, or even online traditional learners, are so profound that you may not even have the right basis in place if you're thinking about using a learning management system. At Argosy, they built their whole program for competency-based on top of Salesforce. Why would they do that? Anybody know about Salesforce? So in the business world, Salesforce is a sales automation system, but more important, it's a customer relationship management system. It tracks every interaction that that user has with your system, and it gives you back meaningful, actionable data. So they've got a bunch of counselors, mentors, coaches who act on that data that they collect from every interaction. And collecting that data on top of an LMS was simply an impossibility. So that's why they began there. You know, faculty roles. We've heard some underpinnings, under rumblings about faculty roles. The reality is faculty are going to be subject matter experts. They're going to be instructors. They're going to be the researchers. They're going to be instructional designers. They're going to play all of these roles. I don't think they all necessarily know what the roles are. So it's our job to communicate what the roles are in the evolving models, right? And then to provide them with support systems and with these dashboards to enable them to succeed. We talked a little about accountability and ROI. Sort of the last thing I wanted to touch on, and Allison, you pointed it out in your talk this morning as well, this notion around ambiguity and change. It's just pervasive. Sure, we can talk about alternative credentials and alternatives to the credit hour. We can talk about evolving models for what it means to be higher educated or degree qualified. All of that is changing fast. And whatever platform, whatever basis we put in place is going to need to change fast to account for that. There are a couple of ideas really prominent in business right now that haven't yet made their way into the academy. And I think they're things that, from a system design perspective, merit some consideration. So the first is a sort of interoperability or web architecture kind of a model that supports interacting web services that are plug and play. So maybe you've got a core LMS system, but it's got open channels so that you can plug in a retention or an analytics or a financial aid solution. Increasingly, those changes those systems are going to change according to what happens in the marketplace, and we have to have this pluggable cloud-based infrastructure, right? And secondly, there's this notion around lean, agile startup methodology. Has anybody heard of this? The gist of it is, start with small project ideas. Frame them up so that they meet the minimum requirements, test them, watch the data, and iterate quickly. So as I talk to people about new ideas like open badges or competency-based learning, I often say, what can we get done in 6 months? Right? Now, I don't know the nuances of how can we get financial aid to pay for it. That's clearly something that's, but I know there's a culture around grant writing and around getting this funded. So I'd say, if you're thinking about where do we start, it all feels a little bit overwhelming as you leave. Ask yourself, what could we get done in 6 months? What could we design and build in 4 weeks, release, study it in the wild for 8 or 10 weeks, collect the data, analyze it, and make decisions from? Okay? So that's all I have. I do have one more image, and I promised Mike I would put this up. This is that NAU competency-based transcript. So as we think about how you communicate back in a competency-based world, and thanks to Corey Gordon, actually, from NAU for this. Van, you might recognize this is a slide from your presentation at our conference last month. I think Corey gave this to you, and then I took it from you. But that's what a competency-based transcript begins to look like. And I think I'll leave this up, Mike, if you want to comment on that and how it differs, how it might vex a registrar. I'll leave it as a sort of a straw man.
Thank you. I'm going to follow Robert's lead and just sit here. I'm trying to think about, as an admissions director or registrar at a traditional institution, how I would apply that. I mean, that's one of the things I'll circle back to here. First, just to know AACRAO, we're an old organization. We've been around 104 years, a long time. We have 11,000 members at 2,400 institutions in over 40 countries. So we've got a little bit of a global footprint, primarily because we do professional development for international admissions folks, and we retain a database of placement recommendations and equivalencies for about 240 countries that's used by the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Services to do things like issue H-1 visas. But primarily we're known as professional development for registrars and admissions folks. I do want to give a nod to, at least we do have two registrars in the room. Darren Hobbs is here from Western Governors University, also an AACRAO member, and Christy Wold McCormick, who is currently at North Dakota State University, but on her way to beautiful Boulder, Colorado, to be their registrar in June. Part of our approach is we engage our practitioners to try and help us identify these best practices and share them with others. So there are two people who I certainly would be looking to help untangle all of this and try to figure out how we serve our campuses and our students. A couple of things that we do that circle around to this: we publish transcript guidance to our members. We've done it for many, many years. Best practices around what should be on a transcript. And again, that's often pretty conventional, but that's sort of how it's worked. We also do a document that's called Transfer Credit Practices that reports how credit transfers within every state, how institutions apply it, et cetera. And we also have developed the guidelines, actually the standards for electronic exchange of transcripts. We did that a long time ago. Those were first published in about 1991. So they've been around a long time. It's called electronic data interchange, and it was done by our SPEEDY committee. Since then, they've developed other forms of transferring credit, but that's really important to be thinking about electronic delivery of student records, because that's the direction that it's going. We're talking about alternative pathways, and of course competency-based education tends to take up most of the air in the room when you have that conversation. But I do want to just remind people to also be thinking about, two other threads that we're watching. Veterans returning to our college campuses. That's a big one that people need to be watching. I'm currently chairing an ACE task force reviewing the credit recommendations from military experience and from their workplace experience. And we're actually trying to develop a new value statement, because we felt like it's been pretty stagnant in terms of the recognition of those credit recommendations. And that's something, with all those veterans returning, we need to do a better job of articulating that experience to future college experience. One illustration I saw that's pretty interesting: the schools of engineering are all getting together to evaluate the training that students have gotten, or veterans have gotten in engineering. They identified that it's mostly practical applied, missing some of the theory. Well, they're looking at designing a 1 credit or 2 credit bridge theory course that fills in what's missing, so that you come out and then you're ready to actually step into the next course. A pretty logical solution, but it does take people sitting down and looking at that and making that conclusion. The other alternative pathway I'd encourage us to watch is dual enrollment. For the first time, the National Student Clearinghouse did a report on its completion reports that included dual enrollment. And interestingly, students who came into college with dual enrollment had a 12 percentage point better completion rate than students that did not. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. That could just be self-selection, but nonetheless, it seems to be working, and that's something to explore, allowing young students who are capable of college-level work to do it before they arrive on our campuses. So I'll get to The next part's mostly about competency-based education, but I want to talk about 3 administrative considerations that I encourage you to look at as you're developing your programs. One is around the student information systems, one is around transcripts, and the other is around the notion of transfer and articulation. I think they're all really important. Of course, the financial aid's a big part, but that's your expertise, and thankfully I don't have to try to describe how to stay in compliance with Title IV. That's a big problem. But 95% of colleges and universities use a vendor-supported student information system. The other 5% have some sort of legacy product that's out there. I would not characterize any of our vendor-supported SISs as being particularly nimble. They're designed for large-scale, large institutions of various variety. They weren't even designed for higher education. They come out of the business world and are brought to us. So it's really difficult to get them to do the things that you want. One illustration, Aaron Brower mentioned at the Wisconsin Extension System, trying to put the learning outcomes, something more like that number 2 or the one on the top, into the 17-character field that's in PeopleSoft for a course title that's used to things like ENG 101, POLSCI 215. It doesn't accommodate a long narrative. But if you start thinking in electronic format, you have a lot more options there. And that in fact, is the way I think everybody needs to consider is what is your program going to look like in an electronic format? Because you can do so many more things. You can include learning outcomes, you can include course descriptions. Even if you're doing conventional approaches, you have much more that you can do in an electronic format. And I don't even mean PDF format. PDF is kind of a stagnant approach. It's just a snapshot. People should be thinking about EDI or XML capabilities to be able to do this. Transfer and articulation. This is a big issue. 42% of all students who earn their first credential, their first associate's degree or bachelor's degree, transferred at least once. So it's nearly half of students. So a lot of these things would not be issues if those students would just stay at your institution and you just follow your approach all the way through vertically and finish, and then it would all be fine. But that's simply not the case. One illustration, I spent many years in Washington State, where we had the fabulous institution, the Evergreen State College. And if you're not familiar with the Evergreen State College, it does not have majors, it does not have grades, everything's interdisciplinary, and they do narrative transcripts. So when a student transfers, which they do occasionally, and they arrive on my campus, I had to try and unpack this and apply it into a conventional course framework. I mean, it's a little bit like this. I mean, that's one of the challenges. I think campuses that are used to prior learning, used doing competency, are much better at translating things into that than conventional campuses are in translating competencies and narratives into a conventional format. So it's just something to watch. You have to know that many of your students will be transferring from their school to another. And again, these processes are increasingly electronic. Most campuses now are using degree audits to help move their students through the system, and those are course-based. Now, it doesn't mean you couldn't do that in a competency-based framework. And instead of having a student pass through courses, you pass through competencies. But I think those are the kind of things you have to think about, because that's what's helped keep students on track. One of the things that we're watching really closely is, when do you start describing best practices, and when do you consider standardization? I actually don't think we're even close to standardizing anything around competency-based education. It's still a very big sandbox. There are some promising things, though. For example, the P20 Electronic Standards Council has just sent out for comment a course inventory file format to be able to electronically exchange course descriptions and syllabi. We haven't been able to do that. Now, again, that's a traditional framework, but once that gets established, that would be a really good format to consider the translation of learning outcomes into an electronic format to be able to exchange them electronically. So I encourage everybody right now to work closely with their registrars and admissions people And, you know, this is, I hate to recommend this, but I think while you innovate, just be prepared to be able to translate what you're doing into a conventional format, at least to serve students who choose to leave. I don't know, Darren, if you get many questions coming back to you. Help me understand a little bit more what you did at Western Governors. I mean, Southern New Hampshire, Northern Arizona will probably get those kinds of questions. And I'm not saying that you necessarily need to keep a course framework, but be prepared to help traditional campuses translate some of that to help the students that transfer. So I'll leave it at that. So it sounds like NAU is keeping a parallel. I mean, that's a big question, is this whole concept of the extension of the transcript. It's not just learning outcomes. Students want us to capture their leadership experiences. They want to capture their research. They want to capture a much broader set of experience than our current transcript does. So, you know, do you do that in the transcript? Do you do a separate document? Do you do like the Europeans do with the diploma supplement? I mean, those are all the kinds of questions that we're thinking about, and that maybe we should look to Europe. They're way ahead of us in terms of looking at outcomes and competencies.
Well, thank you to all our panelists. It raised lots of interesting things. And, you know, and I guess I can't help but reiterate the fact that as you're looking at developing new programs, as you're looking at new piloting things, that you really have to engage the financial aid folks, the registrars, as early as possible in the conversation. It will save you hours of heartache, and it will save you hours of trying to patch relationships that could happen. For example, you know, I know even in our institutions, we do innovative things and we ask the registrars, okay, make this happen. And they're like, what? Why didn't you ask us 12 months ago when we could have done something about it instead of now? And then there's finger pointing, well, they won't let us do it. Well, they're irresponsible, et cetera. And the loser in all this is really our students, who we were actually trying to help when we started this pilot. So at this time, I know there are Callie and folks and Molly have microphones to ask questions. Don't be shy. Drink your water. You'll be peppy and alert. You'll be hydrated.
Either questions or comments.
Actually, while we're waiting for somebody else, Christy, I have a question for you in terms of your whole case management. So when a person and a student applies, do you have a case manager person that follows the student throughout the entire process, or does the student get handed off?
We use the term case manager just to capture who handles the student at that given moment. So in the beginning of the process, the case manager is typically an admissions counselor, and the admissions counselor will go through a given set of steps and then hand off to the academic coach. And then at the end, there's a handoff to the career coach for transition into the workforce.
So at the academic career coach, then I would have the same career coach until I transition out?
Yes.
Great. How many do you have?
Our ratio currently is about 80-1.
Okay. Peter, you had a comment? Oh, Peter.
Yeah, a comment and a question, I think, largely for Peter and Michael, but it involves all of you. Historically, and for me that's the last 45 years, anybody who plays around with alternative assessments is generally decried by almost everybody else as being a low-quality crudmonger. And there is this whole branding thing that goes on, and frankly, historically, AACRAO's been part of it, not any longer, and I'm really delighted to hear your comments. But the point of the matter is, it strikes me, one, there is a new market forming, which is of institutions that are friendly to adults and do not make them relearn things. Say, it's my responsibility to understand where you are and how to move you from where you are to where you want to go. So that institutions that play the old game, I think, increasingly will be harmed in terms of getting older students, which is the growing student population. And the second part of that is, though, going back to that natural instinct in higher education, how do you think we can change the nature of the conversation so that we are focused on real learning and the evidence that real learning has happened, and not on who did it, when did it happen, where did it happen, and how do I feel about it? Because that hasn't, I don't think it's gone away, but we're walking right into it.
Well, my comment, I heard AACU mentioned a couple of times. I'm really impressed with their framework in terms of having all, irrespective of what approach you use, whether it's course-based or it's blended learning or it's what's the term you call for Western governors, kind of a little bit disengaged. I think this defining of learning outcomes is just essential, and it has to take place everywhere. They also have published how poorly we have been doing as higher ed institutions in terms of actually adding learning to students while they're at our campuses. That alone should be embarrassing because it's staggeringly poor. I also think what's going to change this a little bit, and I'm almost going to be agreeing with your assessment of what AACRAO might have said before. When you have systems like the University of Wisconsin entering into this conversation, Ohio is now moving into a really broad prior learning assessment approach that every campus in the state, including the Ohio State University, will be in that. Suddenly, I mean, if a few of these folks just to say, okay, get rid of your stereotypes about what institutions are doing this is now mainstream, it's the way to move forward, respected organizations are doing it, everybody needs to get on board.
Yeah, I think so. New York State, where I live, same sort of situation going on. The largest market out there that's available to all of us is in higher education is degree completers. Right? A ton of people out there who start a degree and never finish it, and we need to find a way to meet them on their terms. James mentioned this to me this morning in a breakout that we had. James from Utah State. We tend to do a bad job of meeting the students on the terms that they're at. So not to be a harbinger of doom, but there's a lot of external competition out there these days too. You can't open the newspaper in the morning or read your online feed without seeing something that's disrupting higher education, that's saying not everybody needs a degree. There's a much broader range of products that existing higher ed institutions produce besides just associates, bachelor's, and graduate degrees. I think the demand for those programs and the flexibility they might yield could be one intermediate point, an entry way in. I've talked to some continuing ed programs that have certificate-based programs that they're using as their bridge to a degree, right? And some of those are a direct assessment model for competencies, which is kind of an innovative way. Yeah.
I think there was somebody here.
Hello? Okay. Yes, I am. I'm Kristen Brown from the University of Louisville. We are just starting to think about getting into competency-based education, as Al mentioned, as part of the Commonwealth College for just one program. So I know a lot of people here have done this at a system level or multiple program level, so we're trying to not rock the boat on the back end of the systems too much because we don't know how big this is going to go. So is there a way to start getting into competency-based education without having to manipulate any back-end systems significantly? And if not, what are the baseline considerations that we have to come to the table with enrollment management teams and systems to be able to have the conversation so that we can do it without having such a huge financial burden out of the gate?
Well, I was almost going to say, I was thinking back to the very first session this morning where there was that continuum of which types of CBE are least disruptive to kind of financial aid and other federal compliance. I think that's almost the same thing on the college campus, where if you do it in a course framework, have faculty define learning outcomes, define assignments, define assessments. You've moved into a competency framework, and you can do that within courses. I think that seems to me to be the place to start. And if you want to capture learning outcomes, I don't know what system you have, whether it's an Oracle or a Lucian-based system, but even Oracle has an alt transcript in there where you can capture learning outcomes side by side with courses. So you'd have them there, or you could even do it in your learning management system. There's ways to capture those rubrics, but I think they're not mutually exclusive at all.
I'd just add, the lessons I've heard from a couple of different institutions that are a little farther down the road are at every turn, you want to fully document exactly what you're doing so that at some point you can map it back to credit hours. That's the fastest pathway to implementing a CBE program.
And that's where I was going to go with that as well. We use Ellucian, the old banner system, as our student information system, but we have some legacy systems that interact with it using Salesforce for CRM. But again, to his point, the course-based with credit equivalency is probably the path of least resistance. If you want to choose direct assessment like SNHU or Capella, there's an extra hurdle to jump through to get approval from the Secretary of Education to offer that type of program. So I think the credit-based with credit equivalency, the flexible definition of a credit hour gives you some abilities to be flexible, but I would certainly bring your student services and your financial aid folks to the table early, because they're going to have to figure out how they're going to meet those admitted, enrolled, making satisfactory progress. Those are really key parts that they need to engage in early.
And we didn't touch on this, but it may be a faculty change management issue as well. If you're going to use the same faculty to do your competency-based program as your traditional program, you've got a lot of work to do with them. Right?
So the good thing on that role is that I think many of our institutions, even the traditional faculty and whatever, we're looking really at student learning outcomes, and so that has helped drive this conversation a little closer to each other, I think. Sally.
Sally Johnstone from WGU. I want to, everything you guys have said, terrifically important, but I want to refocus us back on some of the things Christy was talking about. We know that the direct and intensive support of students in this framework is critical in distance learning too. And my sense is, while I really enjoyed your very succinct and great explanation of your systems, one of the things you didn't mention that I think could be useful for people to be aware of is the pieces of this that are legacies from your distance learning framework and the ways in which you've automated some of the student tracking. Because otherwise you end up with costs that are out the whatever. And you guys have that tool that you've put in place, and I think that a lot of people in the room might benefit from hearing about it.
As I mentioned before, we did some piloting of case management in our online division with online students prior to this, and that did help set us up with a good foundation. We use a case management tool at Sinclair, Student Success Plan. It's an open source tool that was created at Sinclair. But it does help us to organize our caseload, and it's helped us to do a little bit of the benchmarking and tracking that Sally mentioned. And so as we started this project, we looked at the past and said, what would we like to improve about what we were doing before? And we didn't have a lot of in-term data on students, and that became a pretty big problem for us. If you don't know what they're doing inside the courses, you're behind the curve by the time you're counseling them at the end of the term on next steps and how they should proceed. So a lot of the reporting that we've done for the grant and the reports that I mentioned, they started out all manual, and that's pretty much how all of our CBE project has gone. It starts out manual and with a lot of legwork from a lot of individuals, and then we've gradually refined it, and now we have, for instance, the weekly caseload report that comes to our coaches. It's pulled directly from our LMS. So it's less labor intensive than it was at one time. But the tool that we use to kind of manage everything is Student Success Plan, and we are monitoring students using that tool, which is giving the coach a lot of guidance on where to make the interventions and how to organize and prioritize their time with students, which allows us to serve more students.
So if you want to look at it, find Christy after this. Any other questions, comments? Well, I'm going to make an executive decision here. Since, if you look at your schedule, it says this ends at 2:15, but the next thing starts at 2:15. And we're humans, so we have to have time to walk from here to there, stop and get some more water, or relieve us of some water. So I'm going to end us here so that you have 5 minutes to get to the next breakout sessions, which are in the same 3 rooms, Amethyst, Olympus A, and Sundance. So thank you. Before we go, let's thank our panelists for